Welcome, friends. It is the end of the week. Week one, day 3 lecture. We did it. Congratulations. You've survived your first week. That's amazing. You should be very, very proud. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We got a little bit of a bigger one today. Hopefully, we can tie up some pieces and help you guys fully understand some of the stuff as you for your assignments. First thing is discussion questions are due Sunday. All discussion questions should be fixed. So if you are still having issues with discussion questions, please let me know immediately because all of those should have been fixed like within a day or two ago. So please go try that. And if you have some issues, please let me know. I'll extend that day just a little bit, but please let me know. If you are, please go try this and see. And if you can't, then I need to know immediately. Core assignments, you have 3 of them. You've got, again, you can find those here in our class assignment checklist right here. You've got registration form. We talked about forms yesterday in office hour, plotting our blocks. If you guys are having any issues, Uriah said that he crushed this assignment. So if you guys are having issues, I am offering them up just to kind of help. And this is a great way if you've already done it as well. If you're needing some help, put that on Discord. And if you've already done it and want to add in some help as well, then please help each other out, especially on the weekends. That does help. And then you got GitHub blocks. Now we're going to talk about a couple things with display flex, and how we can sort of manipulate that compared to margin and or padding. So we will make sure that everything is all good to go there. But you do have those core assignments. Those are due at 11:59 Pacific time on Sunday. So make sure you guys get those in. Just as a reminder, you have to have 90% of core assignments done each week, or else you can be considered falling behind. Now, I believe we don't check until like an official check-in until week 2, but you will have an unofficial check-in next week. And if you're falling behind, we'll shoot you an email. On an official check-in, if you are below the 60% range, there's kind of 3 tiers that you can be in. You can either be 90% or above, meaning that you're in compliance, you are good to go. Cool, you're crushing it. Second tier is 89% to 60%, meaning that you are falling behind, but you're not super far behind. You've done 60% to 89% of the assignments. That's what we consider as falling behind. That's literally what we put, is that you are falling behind, and you might get like an email that says, hey, or you should definitely do some of these assignments because you're falling behind. Anything below 60%. So let's say that you've got, let's say that you are at like 40%. If it is an official check-in, then you will go on what we call probation, meaning that you are not owning and or not living up to, but you are not doing what you are supposed to do. And so if that happens, then what will happen is you get 3 probations for the entire coding dojo. So not just this class, the entire coding dojo. And then if you break those, and if you do more than 3, or if you go on probation 3 or more times, and you go up for academic dismissal, meaning that you are not keeping up with the program. You don't want to do that. So try to minimize that. Obviously, life happens. And so sometimes that just might be outside of your realm, right? You're going to plan on doing it on a Friday or Saturday or Sunday, and then something really drastic happens and you can't get it done. That's why there's 3 of them there, but don't just, not do it and then kind of go on probation. Again, that's not this week, I don't believe. It's the next week, but it's every 2 weeks. So please make sure that you are keeping up. That's for discussion questions as well. So if you are not keeping up with your discussion questions, then you can go on probation for that as well. So it's core assignments and discussion questions. Cool. Any questions on those 2 things? And kind of what I just said? Okay. In office hour, we talked about margin, padding, and color. We talked about using the color picker. We talked about the hexadecimal versus RGB color. We talked about the difference between padding and margin. We had a good explanation, and then had an explanation. Then we asked ChatGPT, and thankfully they were aligned. So that's good. So had a good understanding. If you're struggling with that, please make sure you go watch the office hour Just as a reminder, all lectures and office hours are on our class sheet. Here, if you just click on this, this is our lecture 1, lecture 2, and then office hour. And I do write what we talked about. So I'll put here office hour, padding, padding, margin, color. And we also did some CSS Diner, where we just played with this game and tried to work on selectors. We got pretty advanced. Reba led the charge on the advanced selectors. And so we kind of looked at a couple what we call adjacent sibling selectors, how we can do that, the difference between a plus and a tilde. We learned about octographs or octotrophs, something like that, which is basically a hashtag. So we talked about some fun stuff, and it's all recorded here in this office hour. I did pause it when it was kind of downtime. So if it kind of cuts pretty quickly, that's just what it is. I paused it and then I restarted it. Cool. Wanted to talk just a little bit about CSS, go over a quick overview of what we did yesterday. Yesterday, we in class talked about a few things. We talked about setting up a project, how we can do that. We talked about some selectors and some basics. So we talked about whenever we want to, if we've got a CSS file, we want to connect it, we use the link element, right? So that way we can connect this to an index.html or a display, whichever HTML. If I want to connect this, I can do that using the link. So I come here in my head. Once this opens, I'm not sure why VS Code's been very, very, very slow for me lately. Well, maybe that's it. Here in our head, we just say link, and I'm going to say CSS, and it already does it for me. Remember, we tell it that it's a style sheet, and then we tell where it is located. And we talked yesterday all about if it's located in a certain file, how we deal with those file structures. Right now, it's not, so we just have it as a sibling, as an adjacent file, so we can just do style.css. We talked about how we would link it there. Let me close a few things. Maybe that's it. Maybe my computer is just slow right now. Okay. Too many things going on. We talked about calling elements and how we do selectors. And with that, the big thing we talked about was a class versus an ID, right? Where we can identify that they had different weights. Does anybody remember sort of the hierarchy? I think yesterday we used Jester, Prince, and King, but what the hierarchy of a class, a normal base element, a class, and an ID, which is the most important, which is sort of the middle and which is the lowest priority. Anybody remember?
I think like ID was like 100. ID was 100. Class I think was 10. I think anything under that, like the general like P or anchor tags were like a 1.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a
Scale.
great way to think about it, right? The ID has the most priority, right? It will overwrite anything. A class has the middle priority. It's more important than just a base element. So if I just say P, then or if a P has a class, the class will always overwrite that. And then a P is just sort of based there. And we also witnessed too that if we just change the color of a P tag, but then that P tag had a class that also had a different color, that even if the P tag was red at the end, the class still superseded it. Can anybody remember? How does it read top to bottom? Does it read side to side? Does it read by alphabetical order? If it's going, if there was two that were, let's say I had something with two. Anybody remember what it was? Two classes. Which one would it read? Yeah, Lucas. It reads top to bottom, right? And so if I've got something with two classes, whatever the last class is at the bottom, that's what's going to be applied. So always make sure that we have an understanding of where everything is at in that regard. Cool. So today, what I want to talk about is a few things. We're going to talk about display flex. And so in our actual project here, we're going to talk about sort of this box model first, inline block box model. And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about displays, where we're going to talk about flex, the flex advantage, why. There's a great video here for 14 minutes on why we would want to do that, what this allows us to do. And it even just being dynamic. So I would really say like this curriculum is really, really great to kind of walk through, flex our blocks. This is it's a hard assignment, but really this is going to give you a lot of information. Doing this assignment is going to be key, and maybe we can do it in an office hour next week. Because it's just a practice, so I can do that. But this is going to be a great one for as you're building up for GitHub blocks and you're needing to do this, right? When you're needing to do this flex our blocks is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful assignment for that. It's hard, but it's a good one. So before we get started, I want to talk about something that's actually, we're going to go back, if you can remember, 3 whole days ago. We're going to talk about an element within HTML, and it's called a div. Now, when we are looking at sort of a normal sort of website, so we're going to take the Coding Dojo login platform. You can see that we've got all of these elements. And if I were to inspect it, you'll be able to see our HTML. We have all kinds of stuff, right? Scripts and HTML and a whole bunch of things, but you will constantly see this word called a div, right? What is this div? What is this div? In our nav class, we got divs, we got another div, we have a UL, right? We have LIs, we have all these elements, and you can see that they are all within a div. So you might wonder, what the heck is this div? I've never heard of that. I see that there's a UL and LI, there's all this stuff. Well, in our chat, Vega, you have it exactly. Div is an element we can use within HTML to hold other elements together. So in this case, if we're looking at this div, we're saying, okay, we want this to be a navigation bar, right? They can go to courses or unit or assignment checklists or stats or exams or whatever. Instead of just having a UL and having to navigate, what we can do is actually make it's kind of like it's called a Lego idea, or I like to call it like a box, where we say, okay, looking at this, how does this operate? I'm kind of thinking, all right, here, this might kind of go together. Maybe this whole thing goes together, right? This is the top part. There's like a pretty good differential because there's a line here. You've got maybe this piece goes together. Maybe this piece goes together, right? And we're sort of just kind of going through and saying, okay, what is combined, right? I might have this outside piece, but what really goes together? We've got this list right here. Got this list right here. Okay, so these are some images that do some things. If I scroll a little bit, we can see that, okay, well here, these kind of are all combined together. This is a bunch of different elements. It's got a video, it's got a bunch of things. It's all combined together. And so we can really look at, from a high level, we want to make sure we can, it's called the Lego concept, right? How do we piece things together, right? And a div is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful tool for doing that. Instead of just having to navigate all the different element types and kind of dealing with, okay, if I do one, or if I want to move something here or there, I've got to move a whole bunch of different elements here. I can encompass this in a div and say, okay, if I need to move this to the right or to the left, I'm going to move everything. That's a lot easier than moving each individual piece. And so a div is going to be something that you use all the time. That is going to basically be kind of a package of different elements, which is going to be helpful when we are dealing with things. Now, one thing to note is what you typically don't want to do is go div heavy. So what that means is, let's say that here we've identified that this is a div, right? I don't need this to be a div, and 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 this to be a div. But I don't need to encompass all of them with a div, because I can just kind of work with them in this one div here. Usually the rule of thumb is this: if you've got one element, it does not need to be a div, right? If you've got more than one element, you can make it a div if it makes sense, right? I don't need to have a div here just because, okay, now I have 2 elements, we're good to go, because it doesn't really make sense. This is all combined, right? This is my navigation bar. This is my unordered list. I can make these all, just put them as one. And if I want to target them, maybe this div has a class of navbar. Right? And then I can say, okay, these are all LIs. I say, okay, in the navbar class, all of those LIs, I want to do something, right? And so I can now target every single element within there, or every single LI within there. But I don't need to give them each their own div. If this doesn't make sense at the beginning, it's going to, like, we're gonna do some practice with it. But I don't need to make it its own div. I can kind of just create one div and then target the elements in there. Remember yesterday when we were talking about classes, and by having a class, or when we were talking about the UL and the LI, instead of giving each LI its own class or the same class, I could just give my UL the class and then apply that to all the LIs. Same sort of idea here. Instead of me having to give this UL a class or each LI a class, a div sort of allows us to say, okay, here is some content that belongs together. And then if I want to target that via the nav bar, I totally can. I totally can. Okay. So that's kind of talking a little bit about divs. Is that clear? Can you guys put a 1 in the chat if divs make sense? Put something in between 0 and 1 if it does not. Cool. So as we deal with these, and as we sort of build this out, sort of start thinking about, okay, when I'm looking at a page, or when I'm trying to recreate a page, let's do the Lego concept. Let's build it out. And then let's build out sort of the outline here. And then we can move forward. And if I was doing it here again, I would sort of start at the beginning. I'd say this is together. I might say this is together. I might say this is together. And I might say this is together, right? And this is a great way to kind of start. These are my divs. And then within that, you can have something else. So let's say, okay, I want to target specifically this. And I want to target specifically this, right? And I can start building this out and getting a little bit more granular. Cool. That'll come with practice as we start building things. Okay. So that's us talking about a div. Now, we did talk a little bit about block and inline block yesterday, but I want to make sure that we really understand and know. By default, certain things have certain properties. So if I inspect this and I click this and I want this p tag, we can see, should gonna come down here. This p tags by default got a display of block. Now, does anybody remember what block versus inline block means? Or does anybody know? Did anybody read specifically this section of difference between block and inline block? Yes, Shannon, exactly. If something is block, that means that it takes up the entire width of the page. Or one thing to say is the entire width of the parent, right? So I mean that by this p tag lives within this div, right? And because it's block, it doesn't take up necessarily all of the page, but within the parent, it's saying, okay, nothing can be on the side. I am taking up this entire space. Right? I am taking up this entire space. Now here, if I scroll down, yeah, it's greedy, right? If I scroll down, I can start seeing that there are things next to each other, right? I got this image here, and then I've got these other kind of images, words, output right here, right? By having things next to each other within a parent, this is what we call inline block, when I am having something as inline block. So let's go code and see what that looks like and how we can do that. So let's come to my index.html. I have a P tag called hello world. And then I'm gonna have a, oh, I don't know what that is. And then let's do another, let's just say an H3 that says goodbye world. That's fine. Cool. If I were to save this right now and open this, I get hello world and goodbye world right here, right? And if I were to come in here and inspect this, you see that this is by default. These are display block, right? And here, this is display block. I'm looking at the body now, but if I click this, this H3 is block. And so what I can do is I can change this display to be inline block. So if I go to my style CSS, how do I change my H3? What do I target? If I'm doing with a selector, what do I do? I'm gonna target that H3. Yep, thanks, Thomas. I say H3. And then what I can do is I can change the display property. So I'm gonna say display, and I want it to be inline block. Cool. So now by doing this, this allows me to have something side by side. So if I come back here and I refresh, well, okay, I see that now if I'm looking at my H3 and I'm looking at my style, I crossed out the default of this block, and now it is inline block, right? So that's good. Does anybody know why is it not side by side? I changed it to inline block, but why is it not side by side?
The other one is still block.
The other one is still block, exactly, right? Just because I changed this one, if I were to look at this guy right here, this is still display block. So here I need to also, I can say something like this too. So I can say comma P, and that means to both of them, I want to do this. Now you can say something like, you can do this. And then do something like that. Like I could do this and this is fine. And now you see that they're side by side. Right? You see that these are now side by side because if I look at this, my P tag is inline block right here. And my H3 is inline block. Now, a faster way, if as you guys are learning, obviously you can just do this and this works great. A faster way is if I'm doing the same thing to both, I can just do a comma P, and that's going to say for all of my H3 elements and my P tag, excuse me, and my P tags here, this is what I want to apply. So it's actually just taking a little bit less code. And then this is doing the same thing. And if I refresh, cool. Great. So now I can deal with this. If I wanted to say something like margin is, let's say 10 pixels, then I can do something like this. And we see that this should push to the side. Refresh. And now I get some margin, right? Where I am pushed away. And I see that this is margin 10 pixels. Now, one thing to note with margin is that when I'm dealing with margin, if I just say 10 pixels, that means that I'm doing 10 pixels to the top, 10 pixels to the right, 10 pixels to the left, and 10 pixels to, or sorry, to the bottom, and 10 pixels to the left. And we saw that because they both sort of moved, right? They moved a little bit this way, and they moved away from each other. And just in its entirety, they moved, right? If I take this away, here they are, and I add 10 pixels, cool. It's moving because it's going all the way around, right? It's pushing this margin from the left, from the top, and from the bottom and the right. Now I can also, let's say I wanted it different, right? I can say something like 10, 13, px, 10, and 13. And if I do this, I come, now come here. Now refresh. Oh, I got some issues. What is this? I should be able to change them. I am incorrect. Cena, do you see what I'm doing incorrect?
Reba said no comma.
Oh, duh. Okay, thanks, Reba. So by doing this, this was what I was going to get to, but here we are. Is if I just do 2, now remember, if I just did 10 pixels, that was shorthand and it applies 10 pixels to everything, right? I can also do just 2 of them, and this is going to be my top and my bottom. And this is going to be my right and my left. If I just do 2, then it will infer that these top, or this first one is top and bottom. This second one is right and left. Now I can do this. And if I do that, I refresh, I still get this top, right, bottom, left. And so you can sort of think about it going in clockwise. I go top, right, bottom, left. But you can see that if I wanted this one, a 16, and I change it, and I refresh. Cool. Now I can say my margin is left. My margin right is 13. And then these two are the same, right? This 10 and this 10. If I wanted, right, if I wanted them all to be the same, like if I just wanted the same kind of around, then I would just apply the 10. If I wanted my right and my left to be the same, I just need the 2. But if I at all want like 3 different unique values, then I need to do it like this, where I'm saying, okay, the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. So you think like top, right, bottom, left, right? Just like a clock is going clockwise, top, right, bottom, left. So those are all the different shorthands for margin. And if you have 0, you actually don't need pixels. You just do that, and then it'll automatically infer that because there's no pixels, so it's just 0. Okay. Any questions on that?
I have a question.
Sure.
When in the other page when you put P and the other one together, right? H3 and P. I'm thinking, isn't it better to separate it? I know you put it together just to make it shorter, but doesn't that limit, like if you want to style them in different ways, isn't it better to put them separate so you can style them differently?
Yeah.
So they don't
So
have to be exactly the same.
yeah, so that would be dependent on what you're trying to do, right? In this case, all we were doing, I just showed you margin, but all we were doing was we were just changing the display inline block, right? That's all we were adding. And so I could have this as 2 separate ones saying the same thing, but then I don't need to. I could do it this way. You're 100% right, Lucas. If anything within my P tag was going to be separate and unique, then yes, I would have those separated out. Like if it had a different color, different background, I would absolutely have those separated out. In this case, we were going to do the same thing to both elements just for this use case. And so then I can just keep them as one. But yeah, if you are building it out and you needing something to be separate, you need the font size to be different, or you need the text font family to be different, then yeah, you would have them separated as 2. And that gives us a little bit more of a robust ability to kind of target each element. But in all we were doing here was we were just doing inline block. That's all I wanted to show. So therefore I could add them together. So it just depends on what you're doing in each assignment.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, so Reba said, could you later just have P tag and edit specific things to the paragraph? I believe so. So let's say that we wanted to do that. Let's just try it. Say P. And we say display. Let's just do block. Let's try it. So here I am defining these and then I'm redefining it simply just as a P tag. Yep. So because it's the last thing that it read and because these have the same weight, it will override it. If this was a class though, then that would not work, right? But yes, Reba, you're exactly right. We could, if we did have to do something unique, I could do something like this, where these are both the same, that's fine. But I could also say, you know, color is red. And then we could do that. Both work. And there is a way that you can modularize your code too much, right? To where it gets confusing. So if this is confusing, then just stick with this. And that's a-okay. And you could say display and unblock. Perfect. Yeah, you could do that. That would be just fine. And now it's red and unblock. Cool. Any other questions on divs and on margin and block and inline block? Okay. What I want to talk about next and what we'll spend the next sort of time of the class is we're going to talk about this idea of display flex. So we just saw that we can do block and inline block. But if I'm wanting to do something like this, right? If I'm wanting to do the even plotting our blocks, this idea right here. Wait. Oh, okay. So same sort of idea. If you're wanting to do plotting our blocks, right now, what you have to do is until you learn this display property, if you were to kind of go back to this box model, what you have to do is you have to go and you set all these divs, right? So we have all of this information. And then I've got to have some CSS and I've got to change the margin. I've got to change all the different things to move it, right? And that can get kind of challenging. This is a challenging assignment, but that can get kind of challenging because now we're pushing margin, we're having padding. The margin, remember, has to be, this is just something to keep in mind when you're dealing with margin and padding, is let's say that this right here is 500 pixels. And each of these, I'll say 500. And each of these is 150. So that adds up to what, 450? That if I want these all side by side and I do inline block, then what I have to make sure though is that my margin and my padding does not, I've got 500, 450, does not add up to more than 50 pixels. So if I've got 10, 10, 10, and 10, one thing to note is if I've got a margin of 10 all around, that these guys, this one will have 10 pixels of margin and this one will have 10 pixels, right? So I need to account for that because if I want them all side by side, the total width of your margin plus your element has to fit within the parent. And so when you're dealing with your margins, you can go to like maybe, you know, if we got 50 here and I'm saying I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, really, margin sides that I need to deal with, I need to make sure that it is all below 50. So if I did 10 pixels, then what each of these is going to do is it's going to be 6. So I'd have 60 So that's going to be above, right? Above what my space is. And anytime that happens, when I'm dealing with block and inline block, it will set elements next to each other as long as they fit within the parent. So if they don't fit within the parent, if we do this, this one would actually kick down because it doesn't fit within the total of 500 pixels. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when we're dealing with this flex, or when we're dealing with this plotting our blocks, is you have to keep in mind the size and make sure that it does not overdo the parent, right? It doesn't outweigh the parent. And then the big trick and the big thing for students that always is confusing is you have to remember that if you've got a margin that goes all the way around, that here it's going to be double because each side or each square is going to have its own margin of 10. So that's where it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that's 60. If I did 10 pixels, that's at least a minimum of 60 just in my margin. That's not going to fit if these are 150 and this is 500 pixels. So all things to keep in mind there. Does that make sense? That's always where students get confused. Okay. So that's where students get confused. And as you can see, it is pretty mathy, right? You like have to get in, you have to get into the pixels. And when we're down here and we see all of these like different, okay, this is 950. That's my container. I've got 300 and 200. And okay, I got to do all this math, right? And get very, very, very confusing. Well, if I want these all kind of, you can see that they're all pretty well spaced. What I can do is I can start and the big brains of CSS decided, hey, this is really kind of a pain to kind of have to deal and operate there. And so they created a display property that I can use to tackle different things. So this is going to be called display flex. And the way that you can think about it is a built-in way to handle, it's kind of like an assisted way to handle items being side by side by using display flex here. And so what it does is it allows you to either have things side by side if you have this like white space, or if you want it something evenly split between each other, I can do lots of things. I can make my content look however I want it to look. So if I've got here, right here, I have display flex. And if I'm dealing with that, I can like, okay, there's an issue here. If I want them centered, I can do that. If I want them starting in a certain spot, I can do that. If I want them, again, if I want to justify the content, I can put it similar. So it's a way that I can just really kind of maneuver and allow this to make this, make all my content look a specific way. The reason this comes in, and we're gonna practice this, so I'm not just gonna talk about this and move on. We're gonna actually build this out and kind of walk through it step by step. A big reason why using display flex is it allows your website to be dynamic. What that means is if you've got whatever viewport you're looking at, no matter what, it'll allow you to have the same spacing, right? If I do space around, it will adjust to whatever sort of screen you are doing. It'll allow you to do whatever space you are doing, right? If I want to space evenly, if I want space around, and it will adjust accordingly. And so this is a really nice tool. Instead of having to do the specific pixels and having to do all those specific things, this allows you to kind of utilize this tool, not make it confined to pixels, because again, if you're on depending on what size of screen you're on, those pixels look different. By doing that, you can make this more dynamic. And so it is a huge advantage. It makes things much, much easier. And you don't have to meticulously check each one and be like, okay, for this one, I got this, because it'll sort of do it for you. Does that make sense?
Oh, I got a question.
Sure.
So like say for example, so for the first image that you showed that had like a bunch of blocks, let's say you define them like in div, like let's say you have a div 1 and 2, and like you have a bunch of divs in divs. Can you define it as like within div 1, the distance between this div and that div should be like a case specific number? I don't know if that makes sense.
You can certainly apply a class to your div.
Mhm.
So you can certainly apply, like, let's say you had div 1 and div 2, and maybe that each div had a class. And then you could say the certain distance, right? So that's where you would target, okay, this div has a margin of 12 pixels to the right, as div 2 has a margin of 14 pixels to the right. That would be a way that you could do that.
Oh, okay. So you can do like in the, let's say you have the main div and then div 1, div 2. And then in the main div, you sort of tell the main div that the distance between div 1 and 2 is like overall it's 20 pixel instead of doing 10 pixel in div 1 and 10 pixel in div 2.
No, so they're separate elements, right? And so the way that the computer reads it is each of these are within a div, right? So
Mhm.
here's my div of content, but then each of these have their own properties. So I'm looking, and this is like a margin top of 0.
Oh,
Here's
okay.
all the CSS that is built in on this. They got a margin block start, margin inline. They've got a lot of stuff built in. So each of these do have their own elements. And even this div, you can see has some different things as well, right? So you can't just say, okay, that's where justify content sort of comes in handy, where you don't have to say, you won't say like, oh, there's this space in between here. Like it's 20 pixels between 1 and 2. But what you can say is you can use tools like justify content space evenly or space between, to basically say, okay, this is the space that I need it to operate. And based on the width of it, you can then add in those, like based off the width of your parent element, it's going to space those evenly or around, or however you deem it to operate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thomas asked a great question. One of your monitors is 4K and the other is 1080p. If you did margins strictly by pixels, it might depends on the size of your monitors, right? And exactly how they're operating. Yeah, that's exactly the reason why being a specific pixel is a challenge, right? Because what you see and what I see are going to be different because our monitors might look different. And so that's where it's really, really, really important to start utilizing tools that make it what we call dynamic, right? A dynamic web page. So if I shrink this, right, it operates differently, right? Versus if I were to build it out, because I got a fairly large monitor, see how I have some extra space, this extra black space, and it changes, that it just makes it dynamic, right? It grows with it based off of however large it is. And so depending on your monitor size, that definitely will affect it. Yeah, Christina has a great tool. It's called Flexbox that can kind of help you as you're dealing with display flex, right? So here it is, and it can kind of help you understand if you're dealing with spacing content. I want this in the center. I want this space around, space evenly, space between. Depends on what you are doing. This is a cool tool to kind of help you there. Okay. So for those that had a 0, let's kind of, we're going to do some coding and then we will see if it gets any better. So I've got this HTML here. We're just going to use the same one from the platform. And then I need to link up my CSS. I'm going to call this display.css. Perfect. And then let's see if we can Okay, I got blue ninja, green ninja, purple ninja, red ninja. Now this isn't showing. Anybody see why? Why is this not showing up? Why are my images not showing up?
They're not on your computer.
They are, they're right here, right?
Oh,
Oh, you didn't specify which folder they're located in?
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Sort of like having before the blue the PNG, having like images, and then
Yeah.
I can't remember which slash it is, but one of those two.
Yep, I've got to do that, right? Because these are not on the same level, right? Because images is on the same level as HTML, I have to say, go into my images folder and then grab my images. Perfect. Wanted to make sure you guys saw that. That's green. And it's fairly common to, and I would say even it's a good practice to have an images folder. Red. Then save that. Perfect. And we come here and we refresh. Great. So I got my little ninjas here. Now, I've got a pretty large screen. And so let's see this display. We've got a width of Dojo. And let's just kind of look at the code. Let's get a good understanding of it. I've got this div. We talked about a div, remember, holds some elements. And this div has an ID of Dojo. And it's got a whole bunch of elements within it, 4 image elements within it. So here it is. It's only 400 pixels long. So let's actually go ahead and increase that. Let's say that we want this to be 980 pixels long. And maybe let's make it a little bit larger. So let's say it is 400 size. Okay. Let's save and refresh. Cool. Now it's a little bit bigger. We have a little bit better of a thing to work through. Cool. We said that we've got a width and a height and a background. It is important when you're dealing with Justify Flex that you do have a width and a height for this parent. And remember, this div of ID Dojo is the parent element to my image, right? That's when we're dealing with Justify content, we're dealing with the parent and applying it to the children. Cool. So let's kind of go through this to start, right? So if I add in display flex, let's see what happens. So I'm gonna come here in my display. I'm gonna add in display. Now we've already seen block and inline block, but let's go to flex. Perfect. Let's come and see what happens to my code. Okay, so these are much, much larger. All right. Let's see why. Cool. So now if we want to align our items, it's going to unstretch our ninjas, right? Then I'm going to align items. Oops. Hold on this. Align items, and I can do a couple things, right? I can do center, and let's start that here. Let's see if that fixes our stretch. And it does. Okay, perfect. Right, so I have this, if I'm looking and inspecting, this is no longer display block within this div, right? Because we said it is flex. Even says flex here. Cool. Display flex, align items is center. Perfect. Now let's go into kind of looking a little bit more at this. We fix the stretch. Perfect. And now when we are dealing with where do we want our content, we use something called justify content, right? And so I say within this justify content, we'll start at center. I think the other one says like flex start, but we'll start here and see what it does. And as these are built in, right, this Emmet code is coming in. It's great to sort of mess with this and see kind of how this works. But if I refresh, cool. That moved it to the center of this. It takes this pixels, right? It takes that this is 980 by 400, and it finds the center of that to make this centered. Again, we don't have to deal, and this is what's nice about it. We don't have to deal with padding and margin and moving things. Display flex will do all of that for us. We just have to kind of bring in the different aspects, right? We've already talked center. We can deal with the flex start or flex end. That means that it's going to obviously do the start or the end. But the big one that we want to do is when we're dealing with justify content, there's going to be sort of three that we need. Now, if we notice that these are centered, they are evenly spaced, right? I didn't do any sort of spacing with these images. They are evenly spaced here. But let's say I wanted them to be a little bit bigger, right? Or a little bit more space. What I could do is I could say space between. And what this is going to do is it's going to give an even amount of space between. Now notice that this does go all the way to the end of my element, right? I've got no padding or anything on my images, so maybe I'd want to add in some padding. But this goes from the very start to the very end. This is my space between. And if I inspect this, I can look here. I see this image, right? Or this div. Got all this information to this. Now the one that, so that'll spread these out evenly, right? These are evenly spaced, but it starts at the top and to the end of my entire width, right? Of my parent, this 980. I can do space around, and that is going to give space, an even amount of space. And this is really where sort of when we're dealing with Flexbox or we're dealing with plotting our blocks, this is great. This gives an even amount of space, right? With each of these. So instead of having to identify, okay, 10 pixels here and 10 pixels here and 12 pixels here and all this stuff, we say, okay, cool. I want to have some space around these. Now notice that this space is different than this space, right? That's applying kind of a buffer around each of these, similar to what we wanted to accomplish. But because this has a buffer and this has a buffer, this is a little bit longer than this. Right? Because it's just basically this doubled. The other one would be space evenly. Come here. And then now I've got an even amount of space between. So the same space between here and here and here and here and here. So you can see that just by doing a few lines of code, instead of having to do some math and identifying, all I have to do is if this width changes, it takes care of it for me. It'll automatically adjust, right? So based on whatever way that I'm reading this content, if I'm on a tablet, if I'm on a phone, if I'm on a computer or laptop or monitor, it's going to adjust for that. That's what we call being dynamic. So display flex is going to be a huge tool in your arsenal as you are building out code that can tell you and show you how to do certain things, right? For this assignment, all we're really doing is we have multiple divs, right? And you're going to do different things where you're going to do maybe space evenly or space between, space around, and you can figure out which ways to do that. But all you have is multiple divs that have some information. So like if I had this, and I had multiple divs that did the same thing, so same sort of idea. Now you shouldn't use that as an ID though, because you don't want to repeat those, but same sort of idea. For the GitHub assignment. Let's see if that changes things. Perfect. So we've already built out basically the GitHub assignment. We have some margin that separates the three different pieces, and then you just handle each one, right? If each one had a different ID or class, and maybe for this assignment, you're going to say, okay, space evenly, space around, and space between. That's all you do. Change the background colors, and then you're good to go. Now, in dealing with divs, it is common, and especially with dealing like with the display flex, it is very common. And there's a tool that we'll end up using towards the end called Bootstrap, that you might have a base layer that you might call this like a ID or class of container. So you'll probably see that on the platform, that you would have basically this div, or yeah, this div called, let's come back to my code, that I would say is, if you say dot container by default, because remember yesterday I showed you guys that if I do a dot, that is a class. And if I do a octotroph, which is a hashtag, then that is an ID. If I do container, this is a very common thing that you're going to have something like this. That you would have a div that holds everything. Octothorpe, sorry, thanks Reba. That you've got a div that holds everything. And so here I would say something like dot container is this one would normally be like a width of, let's say 1000 pixels. Height of, let's say 1000. Yeah, height 1000. And let's say a background color of hot pink, just to really let it see. And what we have is now we have this container. Well, this is over 1000. So one thing you can do is, if you don't know the height, or if you don't have a height here, it'll auto the height. It'll go all the way to the edge, so it'll make sure that it fits, just for the height though. And so that's a super common thing, is to have a container that kind of holds everything. So if we're looking at the GitHub Blocks assignment, you might have something like this. Maybe you've got a big H1 that says GitHub Blocks. And you've got 3 different divs that each have an image within there. And then you can apply that flex evenly or separately, if that makes sense. Okay. Are there any questions? I'm done kind of instructing that we've hit on everything I wanted to introduce you to Justify Content, space between. How are we feeling on this? One. Good. Some ones. Cool. Somebody asked that you got kicked off about setting containers everywhere to set a default width. If so, is it a good practice? So I would say that you want, if you're doing that, like there's different libraries you'd use. So like a Bootstrap, that container would have a default width. One thing to note is that there's not a specific, when you're making dynamic websites, there's not a specific sort of like, if it's above 1080 pixels, then it's like a laptop. And if it's below, there's no full on, this is what, like, this is the standard here. And so there's not necessarily a default width, because it varies, right? Now there's some numbers that are a little bit default, like 1050, I think, is anything greater than 1050. But the percentage is, so like, yeah, Shannon, if you're talking about a percentage, like with Bootstrap, it would just be the percentage of the whole element. So let's try it. let's see if we just did, instead of 1,000 pixels, we did 100%. Let's try that. Let's see what it does and how it changes that. So it's just going to take up no matter what. So yeah, you could do 100% if that's what, if you wanted the whole background to be that, you could absolutely do that.
But is there a reason to do or not do that? I mean, to me, it seems better, but
Yeah. Yeah. And so it would, right? The idea is that if you want it to do 100%, if you're making dynamic web pages, then yes, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Like if you've got like this whole background, like this might be an entire container, and then yeah, here, but you can also have a big div that handles this. So yeah, I would say that it's usually doing 100% is going to be more ideal, because we saw the same thing. What makes it dynamic is if I've got this and it shrinks, cool, it takes up to here, right? My background color takes up to here. I don't need more. And then as it grows, it's just taking up 100% of my page. So yeah, I would say that it's a great place to start and be. If you're dealing with other things like Bootstrap, then there's one called like Container Fluid, and it kind of can get into nuancy stuff. But for what we're starting with and what we're doing at the beginning, I think that is 100% okay.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Great question. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah, Lucas, exactly. When you try it, you'll have questions. Feel free to come next week with office hour. Come with any sort of questions. We'll keep trying to build some stuff. Maybe I'll try to build flex our blocks in office hour, so that way we can see how this works and kind of using this even more. So other than that, that is all I've got for class today. I'll stop the recording here.